Hello and welcome to our joint Chartered Banking Institute and Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment webinar on the delivery of our duty, which is a CPD event created for our members to support the implementation and ongoing development of the consumer duty requirements, which were launched 3 months ago by the FCA. My name is Jo Murphy. I'm Chief Operating Officer at the Chartered Banking Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined by our expert panel, Steve Pateman, Chartered Institute President, and Kath Levy, the Chair of the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment Compliance Forum. Welcome both. As I mentioned in my introduction, today's webinar can support your CPD and is interactive. Today we'll be working through 6 scenarios where you'll be given options to decide the best course of action an organisation should take. You will then be able to vote on screen after being presented with the 3 options. Once you've voted, we will ask our panel to provide some additional considerations and insights for you to consider in your organisation going forward. Consumer duty, like continuous professional development, is about sharing best practice and a focus on continuous improvement. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions through our question and answer function during today's event. Okay, let's move on then to the very first scenario. Okay, so our first question, our first scenario, is Firm Alpha is a well-established large financial services firm. It manufactures and distributes its own products to its own customer base. Historically, Firm Alpha has put in place very comprehensive frameworks, policies, and procedures to demonstrate that its business model for products and services are suitable for its customer base. This includes its pricing policies. As a result, the board of Firm Alpha have taken the decision to rely on its existing processes and frameworks and not to make any specific changes to these as a result of consumer duty. Instead, it will update them as and when the regular review of the framework, policies, or process comes due in the review cycle. The question audience is, will the approach Firm Alpha has decided to adopt be sufficient to be able to demonstrate that it is sufficiently considering fair value? So your answers are, you've got 3 options available to you. So option A is, given the depth, extent, and maturity of the existing frameworks, policies, and procedures, and the plan to review in the regular review cycle, Firm Alpha can demonstrate a sensible and risk-based approach for how they will meet the requirements. The second option B is, Firm Alpha's frameworks, policies, and processes may be sufficient, but it needs to proactively review them against the new requirements and make any changes necessary it identifies immediately. Or option C is, Firm Alpha should put in place a risk-based detailed plan to review all frameworks, policies, and procedures, starting with its pricing policies and those which have the most impact on retail customers. So now over to you, audience. It's your opportunity now to vote with the 3 options available to you. And now we've got the answers on screen. So 15% of our audience have option A. 41% have option B. And then we've got a good split into C. So 44% have option C. Okay, so who's right? So the correct answer was the best option was option C. So Firm Alpha should put in place a risk-based detailed plan to review all framework, policies, and procedures, starting with its pricing policy and those which have the most impact on retail customers. So it was a really close thing there between B and C. So Kath, over to you. Why was option C the best option in that scenario?
Thanks, Jo. So option C is the fuller answer. So in terms of option B, there's lots of good stuff in there in terms of proactively reviewing what you've got in place against new requirements and making any changes necessary. But with option C, we're looking at basically documenting a detailed plan to review everything, all the frameworks, policies and procedures, with a particular focus in this instance to start with the pricing policies, because we're looking at outcome number one of consumer duty and whether retail customers with products and services are getting what they need in relation to their needs and fair value. So particularly look at things like your fair value assessments, your frameworks. Have you considered how you're actually looking at pricing going forwards? But that's the fuller option in terms of actually thinking about all of the different things that you need to consider and documenting it into a plan with some dates and actions that you're going to take. So it's a little bit more fuller than option B.
Thank you, Kath. Steve, just building on that. So fair value, what does that really entail for firms? What culturally needs to change?
So the important difference which is brought out in the correct answer is that in the past, most firms would have had product committees that would have had oversight of products, appropriate product governance, annual review cycles. They would have evaluated the customer needs of the products and so on and so forth, but they would have priced it on the basis of what made economic sense to them as a firm and what was competitive. Whereas consumer duty is asking specifically for firms to consider the value to the consumer and is it fair? And that is having a really significant impact in a number of the deposit markets, for example. So in the past, a lot of large banks would have not considered that they needed to price their deposit products in a competitive way with, say, some of the smaller challenger banks or building societies. And their pricing difference between the two products would have been 200, 300 basis points. Now that gap is less than 100 basis points because the larger banks are having to justify the value they offer in terms of savings products, and the benchmarks they're going to have to use is the external market. And that's seen a number of products, particularly savings products, where the pricing offered by larger banks has significantly improved for consumers. And I think that's pretty much down to the impact of consumer duty.
Great, thank you, Steve. Thanks both of you for that. Okay, so hopefully that's given our audience some additional food for thought on that option, that scenario that's available to them. So now we're going on to scenario number 2. Okay, so scenario number 2 this time. So as a result of the consumer duty requirements, firm Beta has taken the decision to scrap its exit fees for all new customers which had operated on a sliding scale over 0 to 6 years. It has not scrapped these fees for existing customers currently. It has taken the approach the question is the approach taken by firm Beta commensurate with the consumer duty requirements, and are there any risks in this approach? Okay, so again, you've got 3 options. So option A is yes, firm Beta has taken a proportionate approach to considering the needs of its new customers going forward as consumer duty is not retrospective. B, no, firm Beta should undertake an immediate review of whether there are immediate risks or potential to not meet consumer duty requirements by having differing approaches for new and existing customers. And option C is yes, firm Beta has taken a reasonable approach for its new customers, but should review whether there are any risks to its existing customer base from its approach. So 3 options for our audience to decide on, and you should be able to have a vote just about now. Yep, so on screen. So your choices are A, B, or C. So if you just want to select the answer which you believe to be the best of the options available to you. We'll just give you a moment more just to consider the different options on screen. And hopefully the answer should be available. So let's see how you've all voted. If we've got a close one like we did last time. Okay, so a wee bit of difference this time. So option A is 7%, option B is 74%, and option C is 19%. So well done, audience. Option B was the right option. So Kath, I'll come back to you for this first one. And why was option B the best choice available to the organisation?
Thanks, Jo. So I think there's a couple of considerations in particular with this, and it is very topical, which is why we chose this one to use for the fair price and value question. So I think this is where we come into differential pricing, and can the firm demonstrate how they've considered whether they're given a good outcome to all of their customers, and is it a reasonable and a proportionate approach to actually have differential pricing for new and existing customers. And those questions need to be answered by the firm. So they can't just assume that it's okay to do something going forward for new customers and then leave their existing customers on the current pricing strategy for exit charges that they've got in place. They need to be able to think about, does that cause a risk to the firm? So can they actually demonstrate they're meeting consumer duty, but probably more importantly, from a commercial perspective, actually, what will their customers think about this approach? So if they are existing customers and they're being treated differently to new customers, are they going to start voting with their feet? Even if they have to pay exit charges, you might have lost the goodwill of the customer anyway, because you've actually treated somebody who's new with a more advantageous pricing structure than you already are giving your existing customers. And how is that going to impact your existing customer book? Are you running a risk that actually you're actually not going to be seen to be a reasonable firm to your existing customer base? So it's not just about the technical requirement, it's also the risk of what will your customers think in this perspective.
So that's back to, so Steve, that's back to the whole cultural piece around this as well, isn't it? And how we treat our customers and their expectations and managing those as well. So would you have any other advice for organizations trying to navigate this? And it is difficult because it is so far wide reaching across organizations.
I mean, I think financial services have long tended to differentiate between new and existing customers. And clearly consumer duty is asking you to justify why that is an appropriate approach. And in reality, it's quite hard, I think, to argue why it's an appropriate approach. So you see a little bit of this in the savings market. So if I decide to go into a 1-year bond, then I'm committing to a price for a 1-year bond. That's okay. And if that price changes next month and there's a different price, then I've entered into a contract for a year. But if I'm in an easy savings product and I go in at, say, 3.5%, and next month they choose to raise the rate to 4%, in the past, you would have left that back customer book at 3.5%. In the new world, if you left them on 3.5% and obliged them to move into the 4%, there's a perception you're putting barriers in the way of the consumer accessing the right price. And that's why a lot of banks are now saying, we've moved our price up from 3.5% to 4%. You don't need to do anything. You've got the new price from this particular date. So another really good example of the consumer duty really changing the pricing dynamics. And as I think Kath alluded to, there has been some commentary recently about some asset management and investment management firms and their fee structures that are being reviewed. So you're starting, I think what's going to come through in all of the questions is you're starting to see consumer duty as something that has real teeth and has changed behaviours and has changed the way that firms have to think about their products and services and how they interact with customers.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so back to our audience. So this time we're on scenario 3. That's just going to appear for you on screen. So Firm Delta is an online bank that offers current accounts and payments. It's currently reviewing its website and looking at the information it provides on its products and services and the terms and conditions it provides to customers taking out a product. Should Firm Delta continue with its current review and at a later stage, or a later date, update its review procedures to add any further considerations as a result of the introduction of consumer duty? So Three possible answers here again. So option A, yes, it's appropriate for Firm Delta to complete its current review and for future review cycles updates to update its processes. B is no, Firm Delta should pause the current review and undertake an immediate review of the communication review process and redo the whole review again. So start back to the beginning. Or option C is no, Firm Delta should prepare a plan for the review of all of its communications using a risk-based approach and identify those that most impact retail customers to update as a priority. So 3 options again for you there. And up on screen now, you'll have the opportunity to vote for the one that you think is most appropriate. Just give you a few moment longer just to check those options and place your votes. And we should be getting the how you voted on screen coming up now. Okay, so we have here 8% of you believe that it's option A, 5% believe it's option B, and 88% of you believe that it's option C. So let's just see how you've got on with this one. So the option was option B. So I suppose this is good. This is why it's CPD, because it's a good opportunity to learn. This is why we're doing it. So Kath, let's talk about why it's option B. Why is it back to the drawing board?
Yeah, I think it's back to the drawing board for some of the points that we've spoken about in the 2 previous scenarios. So I think the clue in the 3rd option that everybody went for was it was the reasonable approach bit, whereas I think with consumer duty, what the FCA are looking for is for us to take a step back and have a really good think about what we've done before been good enough? And the answer is probably not. So it's a safer answer to go with option B, to just pause and then just take a step back and think about the whole process holistically, because it could be that there are things that we haven't considered in the past that we need to consider now. And because the review is already partway through, we might not have considered those in the things that we've done that have gone through the review to this particular point in time. So it's better to just take a step back and think, okay, let's just pause, have a holistic approach and look across the whole piece. And I think if you look at some of the figures that are coming out in terms of where that people communicate with their bank or their financial services provider, and how easy that is and how well they've understood things, the numbers are not in our favour in terms of how that is playing out, especially at the moment. So you can sort of see that people find it very difficult to communicate with their bank. They find it difficult to understand some of the things that they're being asked to think about when they're actually buying a product or a service or wanting to do something with their financial services provider. So I think it's safer to actually take a step back and just think consumer, good outcomes. Let's just make sure that we've got all of this covered properly and not assume that what we had previously was good enough, because there's a risk to that. I don't know whether anybody's had a chance to have a look at the speech that came out from the FCA yesterday. That was a speech that was made by Nisha Arora, who's the Director of Consumer and Retail Policy, which he quoted some figures in that speech that she gave at Deloitte last week, which were particularly telling, I think, in terms of how consumers are finding the communication process with their bank or financial services provider, and in particular in vulnerable circumstances where there are 14% of adults who've unsuccessfully attempted to contact their provider and have had barriers put in the way in terms of contacting to be able to actually do things that they need to do with their provider. So I think it's those sorts of things which make you think we need to take a step back here and just look at things again with a fresh pair of eyes.
Thanks, Kath, for that. Steve, I suppose in some ways it feels like it feels hard, doesn't it? Like if you've done a whole and owning a website as well, you know, having to go back and redo all of the work that you've done, or take those considerations and the assumptions that you've made at the beginning and look at that. But actually, from a building confidence and trust in the banking sector, then certainly, you know, there is the opportunity, isn't there, to engage consumers and do the right thing to get to the right outcomes. But would you have any additional advice for organizations that are, or any other considerations that they should have?
I think there are two issues. The first one is Consumer Duty is very clear about the need to communicate in a transparent, open and clear way. And the danger, which I think they're kind of looking to address here, is that we in the industry write a lot of the material that appears on websites or appears in product specs and so on and so forth. And we understand the products, and therefore we might look at something and say, well, that's kind of obvious because we understand it. But actually to someone who doesn't work in the industry, it may not be so obvious. So I think engaging with a third party who can look at your website and look at your communications and can say, you know, actually, do you know what, that doesn't really make sense to me as a layman, is probably a really important part of this process for many firms to go through. Because, you know, if you write something, you're going to look at it and think it's okay. But actually you're not reading it as the reader. So I think a lot of firms have gone out and spoken to people like Fairer Finance about looking at their terms and conditions and the way that they explain their product, so that the man on the street can understand it easily and can understand exactly what he or she is buying into, or what he or she is being asked to do in a particular situation. So I think Consumer Duty is very clear about the need for open, transparent, clear communication. And secondly, it's probably better to get someone outside your business to sense check what you said, so that actually you're able to tick that box.
And that's so true, because we hear a lot about financial literacy all of the time, and the actual lack of financial literacy, you know, in the general public. It's so easy to, when you work in a sector for such a long time, the terminology, the phrases, everything seems as if it's very straightforward, but that's not true.
I mean, I think we've, you know, in the past, everyone has probably chuckled over the fact that you get a credit card and along comes terms and conditions that are written by an ant and kind of span 20 pages, and nobody has ever read them. So yeah, to a degree, what this is looking to do is to try and get that 20 pages of small text into something that actually consumers can understand, so they know exactly what obligations they're entering into. And I think that, you know, that's an important step. I don't think it solves the question of financial literacy per se, but to a degree, if it's at least readable, people will start to understand what it is they're engaging in, rather than just picking up this small piece of paper written in ant-like text and just putting it in the bin.
And a lot of legal jargon that most people don't really understand either. So, Kath, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think Steve's absolutely right. I think there's a number of considerations as well, especially with online communications, that are really important, because you're not having a two-way conversation when you're dealing with something that's online. You're actually, as an individual, looking at something and making decisions based on what you've read or what you haven't read. So I think sometimes it's worth firms taking a step back and think about that online journey. How do you know somebody's understood what they've read, and actually have they read it properly? Because you sometimes read things and you skim read them. We all do it. So how much have you actually taken in, and how many things have you actually understood as you've gone through that online journey that you may have been presented with perfectly fine by the firm, but actually the person who's reading it just hasn't taken that in because it's too complicated, to Steve's point, or there's too many things to click through, or you can very easily miss something because there's too much information in one place. So it's important that we do understand how people navigate through some of those communications, and how do they really understand them? Have we tested with individuals and focus groups and, anybody who can look at it to make sure that it's as easily understood as it could be. And that if people don't understand something, there's somewhere they can go to ask a question. So how we check in that people have an ability to actually ask a question at a point in that customer journey, to say, actually, I don't really understand this bit. So could somebody, can somebody explain it? Is there somewhere else I can look for information before I make a decision?
Yeah, sometimes in these documents as well, it's really easy to skip to the bottom and just tick that you've done the box. We seem to make that really easy, don't we, as well? So, yeah. Okay, thank you, panel. Okay, back to our audience. So hopefully we've taken quite a lot away from that scenario there, and then a bit on top of our own knowledge there. So scenario 4. So Firm Omega is a well-known UK bank that offers a full range of products and services. Katie is a vulnerable customer who has banked with Firm Omega for 15 years. She has been suffering with poor mental health and has recently lost her job. Katie suffers from very high anxiety, which has increased since she lost her job, and she finds dealing with phone calls make her anxiety worse. Katie's a current account and a loan with Firm Omega and has recently missed one of her monthly payments. She's obviously very worried that it might take her a while to find another job, especially while she's feeling unwell. She's also very worried about getting behind on her loan payments and wants to talk to her bank. However, her nearest branch is in the next town, and she finds calling the bank very stressful, especially the waiting times. Katie decides to contact her bank through the chat messenger system and explains that she wants to talk to someone about her concerns, referencing that she has lost her job and is unwell. So the question that we've got for you now to consider for this scenario is what actions should Firm Omega take when Katie contacts them through the chat message service? So again, you've got 3 different options available to you here. So option A is, having identified that Katie is potentially a vulnerable customer from the message she has included in her chat, Firm Omega should identify Katie's preference for communications and propose that a member of the vulnerable customers team contact her to provide her with more in-depth support and discuss options with Katie. Option B is, Firm Omega could provide appropriate support to Katie, including asking her how she wants to communicate with the firm to discuss her concerns in more detail, to then agree an appropriate course of action. And option C is, Firm Omega can deal with this through the chat message system, with the member of staff asking Katie questions to understand her needs and then signposting her to further information. So that's the 3 options you have available to you. And on screen now, you have the option to vote. This is a really good scenario because it's building on a hot topic around vulnerable customers and how we treat them as well, and bringing it through our consumer duty lens. So quite a wee bit to consider there. Okay, so hopefully we're going to be able to see your results soon. Okay, so 67% of the audience has opted for option A, 26% for option B, and 7% for option C. So let's see who is correct in this one. So option A is the correct answer. So having identified Katie as a potential vulnerable customer from the message she is included in the chat, Firm Omega should identify Katie's preference from communications and propose that a member of the vulnerable customers team contact her to provide more in-depth support and discuss options with Katie. Okay, Kat, Why is that the best option there?
So it's the fuller option in terms of identifying how Katie wants to be communicated with. So that's quite important, is what is her preference? So we have to, as firms, be clear about we need to offer extra support to vulnerable customers in particular, in terms of how do they want to be communicated with, what is it that will help them in terms of how they communicate with us. So that's quite a key part of the answer, but also it's about having the right training and approach in place for whoever it is that will communicate with Katie to be able to help her in the most appropriate way for her. So it's a good thing to be able to point to somebody who is trained and has expertise in actually supporting vulnerable customers. So in this case, we've suggested a vulnerable customers team, but even if you haven't got a vulnerable customers specific team to support people, then making sure that anybody who deals with customers who may have characteristics of vulnerability is trained to understand what do they need to do to offer support to those vulnerable people, which will vary depending on what the vulnerability is, and not assuming that one size approach fits all. So it's trying to get to that nub of making sure that the firm is really considered. How are they going to offer support to customers who come to them when they're in vulnerable circumstances, and making sure that everybody is able to do that. There is a bit of an assumption in the other two answers that maybe that training isn't as full as it should be, or that it isn't as extensive as we need it to be able to actually help Katie and her needs, because there's a bit of signposting going on there, which is fine, but we need to really understand her needs, and signposting might not be the best option for Katie. It might be she needs to have a conversation with somebody, and the clue is in the sort of the question there, that her bank has closed down in her local area. She finds that she is holding on for a long time when she's ringing them, and there are things that are not working as smoothly as they should. And just point everybody again to the speech the FCA did last week. There's some really good pointers in that in terms of the financial lives survey that they've done recently, and what people are telling the industry in terms of when they're in vulnerable circumstances, how easy have they found to actually approach their bank or firm, or how difficult have they found it to do that at a very difficult point in their lives. So do have a look at that. It's on the FCA website, so it's very easy to access. And that gives you an idea of the sorts of things we need to be considering.
Yeah, it's back to treating people as individuals, isn't it? There's a lot about grouping people together. Now that's not supporting them for the right outcome. Steve, have you got anything more to add to this scenario?
I think that all three of the answers are well intentioned, but as Kath points out, it's not good enough just to be well intentioned. You've really got to direct the vulnerable customers to the people who are best able to support them and provide the support they need. And that's very clear in Consumer Duty. So to your point, Joe, treating people as individuals, not groups of individuals, is kind of where this is heading. So I would imagine in the past that if you were sitting in a bank or another financial services business, you'd looked at each of those answers and felt they all had their own merits. But under Consumer Duty, A is the one that the FCA would expect you to follow.
And I suppose it actually brings the opportunity with technology. We used to talk a lot about AI as well, but actually one of the benefits of that is the ability to take large sources of data, and banks do hold lots and lots of information and data on customers, and be able to aggregate that to actually allow individuals to be treated appropriately. That's actually a positive outcome. That's technology being used in its best way as well. So we have got the tools available to support this now that we wouldn't have had previously.
But I think the regulator is saying, look, they accept that chatbots exist and there are different ways of communicating, and branches will be closed and so on and so forth. They're not telling you can't use chatbots or you can't shut branches. What they're saying is you have to have alternative mechanisms in place for customers to be able to engage with you, and those need to be effective, and they need to be suited to all types of customers in all types of situations. So they're not telling you what your business model needs to be. They're making it clear that your business model has to have these characteristics. It's up to you to decide the best way to deliver those.
And I was at an event, a cross-industry event recently, and all of them used chatbots, and nobody was recommending even their own chatbot. So the chatbots have definitely got a big way to go in terms of treating people as individuals and even getting the answer right for the question. Kath, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, just as you were talking about chatbots, I was thinking about the chatbot doom loop, where you get stuck and you can't get to the next bit that you need to get to. So I think that's something that we really need to think about as firms in terms of actually using the chatbots and testing them to make sure that actually you don't get into that doom loop where you're trying to ask a question and it doesn't know what you're trying to ask it. Because that can come up in certain circumstances. Unless you ask the question in the right way, it doesn't actually point you to the information that you need to be able to find, but offer other mechanisms. So, in somebody like Katie's circumstances where she's got high anxiety, if she gets stuck in that doom loop, it's going to just really raise her anxiety massively, and she's going to feel as if she has nowhere to turn potentially. So making sure that there are signposts for numbers you can contact, or ways of actually getting someone to contact you, so that we do think about those circumstances. And it's a very large proportion of the population who may have vulnerable circumstances. It's not a few people, it's quite a large percentage of people who might have one or more of the characteristics that are important here. So we're doing a disservice if we don't give this enough thought. It's going to affect most people at some point in their lives. So that's a huge number of people that might be impacted at some point that we need to be able to support and help them through the circumstances they find themselves in.
And I think that's something that we've covered in the past. In fact, we did a Chartered Body Alliance webinar maybe a couple of years ago, similar to this, actually, looking at different customer vulnerabilities as well. And vulnerability can happen to us all at any stage in our life. And I think that's something that we've all become much more aware of, particularly following on from the pandemic too. So it is about getting the right process, the right framework at the start in place, isn't it? So, okay, thank you, panel. Okay, so we'll steam through ahead to this next question. So scenario number 5, so Firm Gamma is a large UK bank and has briefed its senior managers and boards on the new consumer duty rules, and the board has taken on the role of the consumer duty champion. Firm Beta is a smaller online bank. Firm Beta has done a lot of work, which has been undertaken by the Chief Compliance Officer, who's been appointed as the consumer duty champion. And has provided updates as part of their general updates to the board. A specific briefing has not yet taken place. So the question for our audience is, what actions should both firms take going forward in relation to the FCA's expectations for governance and oversight? So your options are, so 3 options again. So option A is both firms should document the decisions they have made regarding the appointment of the consumer duty champion and ratify it in the appropriate governance forum. Option B is Firm Gamma should revisit who the consumer duty champion is and appoint a single person into the role. Firm Beta is a smaller firm and can take a proportionate approach and continue with their current approach. Or option C, Firm Gamma should revisit who the consumer duty champion is and appoint a single person into the role. Firm Beta should reconsider the appointment of the Chief Compliance Officer and appoint a NED. So that's your 3 options. So in a moment, you'll have the voting on screen to decide which one you think would be the best choice for the firms. We really got 2 considerations there because you've got 2 different setups, 2 different size of organizations to consider. We'll just give you a moment to look at those answers. Okay, hopefully you've all had an opportunity to vote. So we will see your answers coming up on screen now. Okay, so this is split the audience, and it is a tricky question, I think, because you are looking at two different organisations in size and scope. So we've got 27% of the audience has gone for option A, 34% of the option has gone for option B, and 39% of the audience has gone for option C. So let's have a look to see which was the best of the options available to you. Okay, so it was option C. So Kath, I'll come to you again. Why was option C our best choice?
So, unlike the government, we can't have collective responsibility for consumer duty. So we're not a cabinet. We have to appoint an individual, which is one of the requirements that is set out there. You have to have an individual responsible as consumer duty champion, regardless of the size of the firm. So somebody has to be appointed to take on the role. It needs to be somebody who is sufficiently senior to be able to do justice to the role itself and make sure that the firm is actually on top of this and building it into all of its processes, its culture, and so on. So that's why I think the most appropriate answer is option C. So the chief compliance officer can actually support the board in terms of what are the technical requirements, what are things that they need to consider, and so on. But they shouldn't really take the role on, because you need somebody who can stand to the side and look across the firm holistically, whereas your chief compliance officer has a role to perform anyway, which is advising and monitoring that things are being put in place, but they shouldn't take the role on themselves. It should be an independent individual. So a suggestion is a NED could be a very appropriate person to do that. Because they've got that level of oversight already, they're a senior enough person, they're independent, and they can think about the firm holistically. So that's why option C is the better option. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Definitely document all the decisions that you make in this respect. So option A is correct in terms of documentation, and make sure that it has gone through appropriate governance as to who you're appointing, what their remit is, and what they will undertake in terms of their duties for the role. And also, obviously, your chief compliance officer is going to be pretty critical in terms of being your friendly face to try and explain what are the things that you need to consider. But they do have a separate role in terms of advice and providing oversight and monitoring of what's happening within the firm.
Similar in a way to GDPR, isn't it? In the way that you have to document the decisions and why you've made a decision to categorize data, for instance, in a certain way. Definitely. Steve, anything to build on from Kath's summary?
Not a huge amount. As with the other questions, I think all of the answers demonstrate that the approach was well intentioned, i.e. consumer duty was being taken seriously, but there are explicit requirements for the sponsorship of consumer duty within a firm and the ongoing oversight of compliance with the consumer duty provisions. And as Kath says, that sits at board level and it's not collective, it's assigned to a particular individual. So again, I don't think consumer duty is complicated. It's actually quite explicit in its expectations and its requirements. So this is one of those. So I think the answer is the answer kind of flows from the expectations that are set out in consumer duty.
It does sort of it does make you watch out for an echo chamber, though, doesn't it? In your board and your meetings, where everybody's sitting around thinking, yeah, this looks like we're doing something reasonable here, but as you said, it's straightforward. Just follow the guidance. Don't listen to your own feedback and go, yeah, what we're doing is fine. Yeah, that all seems really well. It ties in. It is about sort of challenging your own thinking and making sure you're following the guidance.
I think there are more challenging areas of consumer duty. For example, how you assess the relevance of your products to your customers, how you assess how those customers view those products and interact with those products. How do you know your customers are satisfied? How do you know their needs are being met? Those areas I think are more complex in terms of how you gather that information and how you then assess that information and the actions that you take as a consequence of it. Whereas I think actually assigning governance responsibility is one of the more simplistic parts of this process.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And how do you evidence that you've done all those parts as well?
Well,
Awesome.
I, as someone who has run banks and still runs one, I find that the hardest element of this, the evidencing. You know, you can have dashboards with complaint numbers and Trustpilot scores and all this, that, and the other. They're kind of helpful pointers, but they're not probably getting to where the regulator probably wants you to get to. So I think that's, for me as a CEO, that's the much more tricky part of this journey.
Thanks, Steve. Kat, did you have something you wanted to build on there? Sorry.
Yeah, I think Steve's point's important, because I think that's where having that one person who is sitting at the board level who can spend the time to really understand how it's all working, I think it's a good shout from the FCA's perspective. It is to have somebody appointed to that role, so they can devote the time to actually really thinking about how that can be evidenced and how that can be discussed across the board, and then fed back to the regulator in terms of, well, this is how we're doing it. So I think it's a pretty critical role, and somebody, you know, will need to take it really seriously to really get to the nub of what's actually happening ongoing across the firm, in respect of what have we done day one, what are we doing on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Kat. Okay, so audience, you'll be glad to know that you are on to your 6 scenarios. This is our final scenario for this session. And if you have got any questions you would like to ask, just please pop them in the question and answer section, because we should have a few minutes available to ask our panel any burning topics, or to go over anything in a bit more detail. So scenario number 6, firm Sigma is currently undertaking a review of its governance processes and asks the member who has been appointed as consumer duty champion for advice on what, if any, extra considerations need to be taken in light of the new consumer duty. What advice should the consumer duty champion provide to the board that they need to consider, and how often should reporting be provided to the board? So that is your question. And your 3 options are: option A, the consumer duty champion should present a detailed plan covering the firm's strategy, purpose, and values, as well as framework, policies, processes, and proposed actions and dates to be managed under the board's governance. An annual report on how the firm is meeting good customer outcomes should be produced for the board. Option B, the consumer duty champion should provide a detailed analysis and plan to the board across all firms' processes and frameworks, with recommendations and actions that need to be taken with firm action dates. Option C is Firm Sigma should update its customer policies and processes and feed results through from its regular monitoring and internal audit reviews to the board. So 3 different options there for you. So over to you to decide which is the best of the options available. Just a minute longer. Hopefully we'll have your results on screen soon. Okay, let's see how you voted in this final one. Okay, so we have 65% of the audience going for option A, 21% option B, and 15% on option C. And the answer is yeah, well done. We're getting there. So almost 2/3 of you identified option A is the correct answer, with Consumer Duty Champion should present a detailed plan covering the firm's strategy, purpose and values, as well as a framework, policies, processes with proposed actions and dates to be managed under the board's governance. An annual report on how the firm is meeting good customer outcomes should be produced for the board. Okay, Kath, over to you. Why was this the best of our choices available to the audience?
Yeah, so the reason why this is the best option from the three that are on the screen, whilst there are good things in B and C, is it's the annual report. You must produce an annual report for how consumer duty is working across your firm for your board. That's not to say that you should only talk about it once a year, but you have to do a State of the Nation report about how it's working and produce it to the board every year. It's one of the requirements that are built into consumer duty. The other things that are mentioned in the other two options are obviously quite important. Internal audit reviews, yes, you should present those to the board and think about, in terms of internal audit processes, how are you demonstrating when you're testing as internal auditors that you're looking for whether there are good outcomes being achieved for customers through the work that you're doing, looking at how the firm's actually complying. And also in terms of making sure that you continually think about at board level what's happening in terms of consumer duty, and not just treat it as an annual exercise. It should be more frequently than that, and that's where the Consumer Duty Champion will come really into the fore, in terms of making sure that this is something that's discussed regularly and that there is regular focus on how the firm is meeting its requirements. I think it's pretty important.
Thanks, Kath. Anything you'd like to build on there, Steve?
The only other point that I would make is, I think what Consumer Duty is seeking to do is, if you like, establish this linear relationship between the purpose of the firm, why it exists, and the products it provides, and then the various aspects of consumer duty that flow from that. So they are very keen on understanding, why do you exist? What products and services are you providing? What are the values of your firm? And then how do they then translate into the consumer duty aspects? So I think in the past, these things have been quite disparate in organizations. Values are sat over here and purpose somewhere over here and compliance over here. So actually these seeks to kind of join these, make the relationship much more clear, transparent, and linear. And actually, having written the covering papers for the consumer duty stuff at the bank that I currently lead, it actually is quite a thoughtful process to go through to think about how those things join up. And actually, I found it quite a reflective process.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing. It's continuous learning, isn't it? It allows you to reflect and then learn from it to get to better outcomes. We've actually got, I know we've got 4 minutes left. I actually got a question that I'd like to ask you both come in from our audience. Steve, I might actually come to you with this one first. So, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge consumer duty will pose to financial organisations over the next year?
I think you've already seen some significant behavioural changes. I think the hardest part will be when you get a year on and you're writing the consumer duty report and you're looking for the evidence to support whatever assertions you may or may not be making in that report. I think that's the hardest bit. Where's that evidence going to come from? What does it look like? How does the board get comfortable with the data that underpins that evidence? That for me is in some ways it's not dissimilar to how businesses are grappling with ESG in terms of how they evidence that their lending policies are reducing the carbon output. It's hard, therefore I don't think you're going to encounter similar. I do think you're going to encounter exactly the same type of challenges in the report and the assessment and the evidence process in the same way as firms are still grappling with that same issue around ESG.
I suppose actually do them both together. We're having to look at the whole lot anyway, do them both just side by side potentially. Yeah. Oh, sorry, on you go, Steve.
No, I was going to say that there are lots of complexities to it, and I think it will be a learning process as to how organisations progress through that first report to the second, to the third, and so on and so forth.
And that as it should be, as it continues. Kath, any thoughts from you about what might be their biggest challenge over the next year?
I think
The date's April, isn't it? The date.
Yeah, Steve's touched on a couple, which are data monitoring, reporting, all those things are pretty key. But I think it's the crux of this is the customer outcomes. So how can you show as a firm that your customer outcomes are being achieved, good customer outcomes being achieved on a regular basis, and that you can show that that's happening, and that your customers would feel the same. So you might feel as a firm that you're getting good customer outcomes, but what would your customers say?
Absolutely, that's a brilliant point. A great point to end on. Sadly, that's all we have time for in this session today. I'd really like to thank our two fantastic panelists, Steve and Kath, for sharing their insight and knowledge with us all today. And also you, our audience. This was an interactive session. It wouldn't have been as thought-provoking if we hadn't had your participation as well. So thank you so much for tuning in and taking part in today's event. And please remember, you can also log it as CPD. Hopefully you've learned lots through the course of the last hour. So thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed today's event and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.